Some of my earliest gaming memories involve playing PC adventure games, primarily by LucasArts and Sierra. It was one of the most popular style of games for home computers at the time, before the FPS, RTS, and RPG genres all started to take over heavily. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we saw a pretty steep decline in the popularity of adventure-style games, but there's been a bit of a resurgence in the past decade or so, a little more in fact. Around the late 2000s, companies like Telltale Games started to appear, and they started creating adventure games for a modern audience. Slowly but surely, we've been getting more and more adventure-style games, to the point where we now have different styles of adventure games. We always did, but we're starting to see that separation in subgenres come along again. For my next few videos, I'm going to look at some PS4 games, specifically walking simulator games. Now, I'm not going to go too much into what a walking sim is because it's pretty much what it says on the tin. 90% of the gameplay is you moving around and walking. Now, most games in the walking simulator style have very minimal levels of interaction. Instead, they tend to heavily rely on setting, atmosphere, and storytelling, which can often start to delve into the whole "is it really a game" argument if there's no goal or nothing to really do other than move from one scene to the next. In some ways, you could argue that they are almost more interactive movies than the FMV games I did were. Or no, because they're not that interactive. But we're getting into a whole other debate here. First one I'm going to look at on PS4 is Dear Esther. Now, Dear Esther originally, I believe, was a Half-Life 2 Source Engine based mod, released, I want to say, around 2008-2009. It later got redeveloped and re-released as its own game in the early 2010s, and then I believe it was 2016 or 2017, let's check the back of this. This has to be the only time that there's no year on it. There's always a year on these things. That's the easy way to figure out when this thing was released. I don't know, but my memory says 2016, so we'll go with 2016. We got Dear Esther Landmark Edition released on the PlayStation 4, as well as I believe Xbox One and of course a PC release. I remember hearing a few people talk about it way back when it was a Source Engine game, so I'm kind of interested to see how it plays because I've not played it before. Usually with these walking simulators, it's basically a case of guessing whether or not there's going to be any level of interaction, or whether you're just going to experience a story told to you as you're walking around. So in the case of Dear Esther, since I've not played it before, there's only one way to find out. Let's give it a shot.
Dear Esther, the morning after I was washed ashore, salt in my ears, sand in my mouth, and the waves always at my ankles, I felt as though everything had conspired to this one last shipwreck. I remembered nothing but water, stones in my belly and my shoes, threatening to drag me under to where only the most listless of creatures swim.
Now, when it comes to walking sims, one of, if not the main character, is often the setting. Being that the whole point of these games is to explore your surroundings and just take a look at things. And Dear Esther is no exception, being set on an abandoned Hebrides island. If you're not too familiar with British geography, these are the Hebrides. And it must be said, it does an exceptional job of looking the part. This is what the Hebrides look like. They've really managed to nail the general aesthetic of the area, and also just the general feel. The weather is right, it's overcast, it's kind of windy. If you didn't know any better, you could probably still make a good guess as to what area of the world this is set in. And from a technical standpoint, graphically it looks pretty good. Sure, it's a little bit dated, it's a 2016 PS4 release, and by that point we'd already had much more impressive games come out visually, but for a small development team where this version of the game was originally released, I believe in 2012, it still holds up pretty well. Particularly the segments that take place inside a network of caves, these look really cool, and are a pretty clever way of varying things up a bit. Whilst it looks the part of an outdoors Hebrides island, that also means there's not an awful lot to feast your eyes on. But cave networks and abandoned buildings, they're realistic things that could be there, and the game paces these areas just right so that you don't get bored of what you're looking at. In terms of the gameplay, there's not a lot to say. When I was on camera, I pretty much summed up what a walking simulator is, and this is a pretty fine example of that. The only thing you can really do is move. Any button not related to movement just zooms the camera in slightly. No items or objects to interact with or pick up, nothing like that. This is hardcore walking sim. Instead of gameplay, it relies on a strong atmosphere and the storyline to get you through. And here the story is presented primarily in a series of voiceovers, which are reading out letters to somebody called Esther, hence the title, Dear Esther.
I dreamt I stood in the centre of the sun, and the solar radiation cooked my heart from the inside. My teeth will curl and my fingernails fall off into my pockets.
Now, I won't delve
like
too far into the storyline itself, but the basics you can go into it knowing without having any kind of spoilers is that you appear to be playing as Esther's husband. Esther has since passed away, and the letters seem to reflect your character's thoughts and feelings towards that, as well as revealing snippets of what exactly happened to her. It's almost like listening to a podcast or audiobook whilst taking a country walk. Each letter is read out when you reach a certain area of the island, but which letters are read out and when, as well as certain parts of the scenery, are actually randomly generated to ensure that each player has a unique experience of the game. And speaking of the elements of the environment, you'll see messages written on walls, strange symbols that look like chemical symbols and mathematical formula. At first it seems kind of strange, but there is a point to them. And what that point is, well, you'll have to play the game to find out, and even then you might interpret the whole story and what you see a little bit differently thanks to all the randomization. On top of that, the story is purposely kind of vague and doesn't tell you all that much outright. Certain things are implied, and you just kind of have to make what you will of it. There's not necessarily a right answer. Now, this is an important point to note, because for some people, this style of storytelling can be a little bit frustrating, so if you're thinking of playing this, just remember, this isn't a game that's just cryptic whilst you're playing it and then it all gets revealed at the end. It stays that way the whole time, and there's no definitive answer. So if you're not into that kind of thing, this may be a wasted experience on you. But if you do happen to play it and you like that kind of thing, like I do, it's a fairly quick game anyway. So if you're not too sure, you don't have to worry too much if you want to give it a go. It's only around 2 hours max. It's not like there's any kind of difficulty in your way, there's no puzzles or obstacles, so total gameplay time is going to be about the same for everyone. You're not exactly going to be blubbering into a pillow by the end of it, but it'll make you think, which for a small game like this is a pretty cool achievement. Oh, and another little cool thing, there's a commentary track for the game. So by selecting this option, instead of getting the usual voiceovers, you'll head over to certain areas, stand on these little things here, and you'll get commentary from the developers.
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled. But one of the good
This is not something I've seen in a video game before, and it's a really interesting way of providing a behind-the-scenes look at the game's development. Whilst you're hearing the commentary, they'll mention something whilst you're experiencing it, which just makes you appreciate it all that much more. It was really interesting, and I learnt a lot about the game's development, why they made it the way they did, and what the overall end goal was. Like some of the games I looked at that had bonus features before, this just makes me want this in even more games. I want to hear more developers talk about their games whilst I'm playing it. Although I suppose in this style of game it's kind of easy, it's extremely linear, whereas in a lot of other things that would be a real difficult and challenging task, so I get why it's not a common thing. Also worth mentioning that this game does have a spiritual successor from the same developers, the Chinese Room. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, and I thought it was worth mentioning here because sadly it doesn't have a physical release, so it won't be something I cover in this video series until hopefully it does one day. If you like the look of Dear Esther or you've played Dear Esther and you want something similar, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture is worth checking out.